You want to tell me how to fight a war with grease on your hands? Colonel Marcus Hale grabbed Emma Carter's report off the table, walked to the window, and threw it into the rain without looking down. 7 pages, 6 months of calculations, 49 simulations. Gone. He turned back slowly, pointed one finger directly at her face. You touch the planes. You do not think about the planes. Come near my briefing room, Ian, and I will personally see to it that you never work on another aircraft in your life. Emma Carter stood completely still. Empty hands, steady eyes, and every single number still perfectly intact inside her head. If this story moves you, if it makes you angry or proud or both, please subscribe to this channel and follow Emma's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Emma Carter had been at Eagle Ridge Air Force Base for 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days. She knew that number precisely because she had written it down in the small brown notebook she kept in the left chest pocket of her flight suit. Not because she was counting down, not because she was unhappy, but because Emma Carter wrote everything down. Numbers, patterns, observations, anomalies. She had been doing it since she was 9 years old, sitting at her father's kitchen table in Boise, Idaho, filling composition notebooks with things she noticed that nobody else seemed to care about. Her father had been a crop duster pilot, not military, not glamorous. He flew low and slow over potato fields in the early morning light, and Emma used to sit on the fence at the edge of the property and watch him bank and turn, reading the wind with his body the way some people read words on a page. He never taught her to fly. There wasn't money for lessons, and besides, he always said the sky wasn't something you learned from a book. You felt it. You earned it. You respected it. He died when Emma was 14. Engine failure. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive. The plane simply came down in a field 3 miles from home because a component that should have been serviced hadn't been, and a man who knew how to read the wind had no way to read the thing that was killing him from the inside. Emma had read the accident report 17 times, and then she had decided with the quiet and absolute certainty of a 14-year-old who had already learned that the world was not fair, but that understanding was still possible. She decided that she would spend her life making sure no one else died because something broke that shouldn't have broken. She enlisted at 19, chose aviation mechanics deliberately, passed every test at the top of her class, not just her class of women, not just her class of enlisted personnel, but her entire cohort across every category. Her instructors noted it. A few of them quietly flagged her file. One of them, a broad-shouldered woman named Master Sergeant Diane Okafor, had pulled Emma aside after her final evaluation and said low and serious, "You know what you are, Carter. You're the kind of person this institution doesn't know what to do with, so you're going to have to be patient." Emma had nodded. She was good at patience. She'd been practicing it since she was 14. Eagle Ridge was her second posting. Her first had been at a base in Virginia, small and administrative, where her skills were largely wasted on routine maintenance of transport aircraft. Eagle Ridge was different. Eagle Ridge was where the real machines lived, the F-22 Raptors, the F-35s, the aircraft that represented the bleeding edge of American air power machines, so precise and so complex that maintaining them was itself a form of advanced engineering. Emma had requested the transfer herself, submitted a 3-page letter explaining why her skill set was being underutilized in Virginia, and had been granted the reassignment 6 weeks later, presumably because someone somewhere had actually read what she wrote. She arrived at Eagle Ridge in January in the kind of Nevada cold that people who had never been to the desert didn't expect. She reported to her supervisor, a heavy-set man named Chief Petty Officer Raymond Gloss, who looked at her record and then looked at her and said, in a way that communicated several things at once, none of them particularly welcoming. "You got good scores," Gloss said. "Yes, sir." "Book scores, Chauvin's. Field evaluations too, sir, all categories." Gloss had nodded the way people nod when they've already decided something and don't particularly want to be argued with. "We'll see how the real work goes," he said. "Bay 3, start with the pre-flight checklists on the 217, and Carter, stay in your lane." Emma had gone to Bay 3. She had done the pre-flight checklist on the 217, and she had immediately noticed 3 things that weren't on the checklist, but probably should have been. She wrote them in her notebook. She didn't say anything yet. She was good at patience. The pilots at Eagle Ridge existed in a world that was physically adjacent to Emma's world, but socially separated from it by something as solid and invisible as a pane of bulletproof glass. They ate in a different section of the mess hall. They had their own briefing rooms, their own locker rooms, their own rhythms and rituals and language. They were the ones whose names got spoken out loud in meetings. They were the ones whose opinions shaped decisions. They were the ones who, when they walked through the hangar, had the kind of physical confidence that came not from arrogance but from being told repeatedly and officially that they were the most important people in the building. Captain David Mercer was the kind of pilot who would have been insufferable if he hadn't also been genuinely excellent. He was 29, third-generation Air Force, had graduated top of his class from the Air Force Academy, and had the kind of jawline that seemed almost architecturally designed to appear in recruiting posters. He knew he was good. He didn't hide that he knew it. And because he was in fact good, the people around him generally let him get away with the knowing. Emma had her first real interaction with Mercer 6 weeks after she arrived at Eagle Ridge on a Tuesday morning in early February, when she was completing a post-flight inspection on his F-22 following a training sortie. She found something. It wasn't on the checklist. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was wrong, a microfracture pattern in one of the fuel line connectors that under certain temperature differentials could cause a pressure irregularity that would be imperceptible to the pilot, but would compound over time in a way that made Emma's stomach tighten when she thought about the trajectory of the numbers. She wrote it up. She submitted it through the proper channel, which meant it went to Gloss, who looked at it and said, "The gauge reads within tolerance." "The gauge reads within tolerance right now," Emma said, "at current ambient temperature. If you run the connector through a thermal stress cycle..." Carter. Gloss set the report down. "The gauge reads within tolerance. Log it as inspected and move on." Emma moved on. She logged it. She also kept a copy in her notebook with the date and the precise measurements and her calculations of the thermal stress trajectory. 3 weeks later, she submitted the report again, this time with additional data she had gathered from 3 subsequent inspections, showing the microfracture had progressed exactly as her calculations had predicted. Gloss looked at the report for a longer time. Then he sent it upstairs to the maintenance officer, a lieutenant colonel whose name was Patterson. Patterson called Emma in. She thought for a moment that this was going to go differently. "Carter," Patterson said, leaning back in his chair, looking at her over the top of her report. "I appreciate thoroughness, I do, but what you're describing here is a theoretical failure mode that falls outside the service manual parameters. The service manual parameters are based on standard operating conditions," Emma said. "If you look at the flight logs for the 217, the sortie patterns over the last quarter have included 3 extended high-altitude engagements that create thermal cycling conditions outside the standard range. If you stress model the connector under those specific conditions..." "Carter," Patterson held up one hand, "do you have a degree in aerospace engineering?" She paused. "No, sir." "Do you have any formal training in structural analysis?" "I completed the advanced maintenance certification at the top of my..." "That's not what I asked." His voice wasn't cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was patient in the way people are patient when they have already decided the conversation is over. "Your job is to maintain the aircraft within the parameters of the service manual. That's what you're certified to do. That's what I need you to do, Alpo. Are we clear?" Emma looked at him for a moment. "Yes, sir," she said. "We're clear." She went back to Bay 3. She picked up her wrench, and she opened her notebook and wrote down one more number, the date, the time, and the precise reading of the microfracture on the date Patterson had closed the report. Because Emma Carter was patient. But Emma Carter also kept records, and records she had learned had a way of eventually mattering. The simulation room was not supposed to be hers. It was a room at the end of the east corridor of the operations building, officially designated for training use by active flight personnel, equipped with 4 full-motion flight simulators that could replicate the cockpit of any aircraft in the American fleet to within a margin of error so small it was measured in milliseconds. The simulators were used by pilots during training cycles, during preparation for specific mission profiles, during evaluation periods. They were not technically supposed to be used by enlisted maintenance personnel, but the simulation room was also between the hours of 11 at night and 5 in the morning, completely empty. Emma had discovered this on her 3rd week at Eagle Ridge, when she had been walking back from the mess hall after a late shift and had seen the light on in the east corridor and had gone to check whether someone had forgotten to power down the equipment because Emma Carter always checked things that weren't supposed to be left on and had found the room empty, the simulators in standby mode and the door unlocked. She had stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she had gone in. She had spent the first night just looking, not touching, not yet just reading the interface panels, familiarizing herself with the control architecture, cross-referencing what she saw with the technical manuals she had memorized in the course of her maintenance work. She understood the systems from the outside, the hydraulics, the avionics, the sensor arrays. Understanding them from the inside, from the perspective of the person they were designed to serve, was something different. She came back the next night and the night after that. Within 2 weeks, she was running scenarios. She started simple basic flight parameters, standard intercept profiles, the kinds of engagements that showed up in the declassified training literature she had been quietly accumulating from public military education, resources from academic papers on aerial tactics, from a collection of history books she kept stacked beside her bunk in the barracks room she shared with a communications specialist named Yolanda, who worked different hours and generally didn't notice when Emma wasn't there. The simulations were not just flying. That was what most people didn't understand about modern aerial combat. It wasn't primarily about the physical act of flying the aircraft. The physical act of flying an F-22 was something that could be trained into a person with enough time and practice. The thing that determined whether you won or lost an engagement was whether you could think, whether you could model the enemy's decision tree faster than the enemy could execute it, whether you could see 3 moves ahead, the shape of the battle before it formed. Emma was very good at seeing things 3 moves ahead. She had been doing it her whole life. As a child reading the accident reports after her father died, she had learned to trace backward from outcomes to causes to find the moment where the trajectory had been fixed, where the ending had been written before anyone knew they were in a story. She did the same thing in the simulators, not just flying the scenarios, but dissecting them, running them forward and backward, changing variables, looking for the fixed points, the moments where the outcome was determined. She built her own scenarios. That was the thing nobody would have guessed, and that Emma herself barely had language for. She wasn't just practicing, she was designing. She was constructing engagement models based on patterns she had identified in open source data about regional threat capabilities, about the kinds of tactics that adversarial air forces had been developing and refining over the past decade, about the gaps and seams in the defensive formations that American squadrons used. Gaps that no one seemed to be officially discussing, but that showed up with quiet consistency whenever Emma ran her models. She found one gap in particular that she couldn't stop thinking about: the Northeast Corridor gap. It wasn't obvious. It appeared only under specific conditions when standard defensive formations were deployed against a particular compression strike pattern, and when 2 specific aircraft in the formation were operating under the thermal stress conditions she had been flagging in her maintenance reports. Under those conditions, there was a window, 8 to 11 minutes depending on atmospheric variables. A window in the Northeast sector where the defensive coverage thinned to something that was in Emma's calculations functionally inadequate. She ran the scenario 47 times over the course of 3 months. She varied the parameters. She threw everything she could think of at it. The window was real, it was consistent, and it was exploitable by anyone who was looking for it. She wrote it up, 7 pages with diagrams and data tables and 3 different mathematical models of the failure probability. She submitted it to Gloss. Gloss forwarded it to Patterson. Patterson forwarded it to Colonel Marcus Hale, the senior commanding officer of the combat wing at Eagle Ridge. And Marcus Hale threw it in the trash. That was the moment Emma had stood in the doorway of the briefing room and watched it happen. The folder landing in the metal wastebasket with a sound like a door closing. Hale turning back to his officers without looking at her. The room rearranging itself around the fact of her dismissal, the way a stream rearranges around a stone. No friction, no acknowledgement, just smooth flow past the obstacle and on. Now, Hale had said, where were we? Emma had stood there for 3 more seconds. Then she had turned around, walked back down the corridor, gone to Bay 3, picked up her wrench, and gone back to work. But she took the folder home with her later that night. She had a copy. She always had a copy. And she went back to the simulation room, and she ran the Northeast Corridor scenario for the 48th time. It was Captain Mercer who first actually talked to her. Not the way officers usually talked to enlisted maintenance crew, the transaction of it, the brief nod, and the task-specific exchange. Actually talked to her. It happened in the hangar on a Saturday afternoon in late March when Mercer was going over his aircraft before an early training flight, and Emma was working in the adjacent bay. He had been standing at the nose of his F-22, looking at something, and he had been standing there for long enough that Emma finally looked up from what she was doing and said, "The sensor housing on the forward array, third bracket from the left, it's slightly misaligned." Mercer had looked at her. "How can you tell from there? The shadow it's casting is 2 degrees off from where it should be." He had looked back at the aircraft. Then he had crouched down and looked at the bracket. Then he had straightened up and looked at Emma again. "You're right," he said. "Carter, right, Bay 3. "Yes, sir." "How long have you been here?" 4 months. He had nodded slowly in a way that was different from the way Patterson and Gloss nodded. It was the nod of someone who was actually processing new information rather than performing the acknowledgement of it. "I heard you submitted something to Colonel Hale," Mercer said. His voice was careful. "A threat analysis." Emma went still. She hadn't known the pilots had heard about that. "Yes, sir. I heard he," Mercer paused, chose his words, "declined to action it." "He threw it in the trash, sir, yes." A silence. Mercer looked at his aircraft for a moment. Then he said, "What was in it?" Emma looked at him. She had learned over 4 months to read the people around her fairly accurately, to distinguish between the people who asked questions because they wanted to appear engaged and the people who asked because they actually wanted to know the answer. Mercer was looking at her with an attention that felt unexpectedly like the second kind. "A defensive formation vulnerability," she said. "Northeast sector, under specific conditions that I believe are increasingly likely given current threat development patterns in the region." "What conditions?" She told him, briefly, precisely, without flourish. The thermal stress model, the formation gap, the compression strike window. She watched his face as she spoke, and she saw the moment when it shifted, the moment when what she was saying moved from the category of noise to the category of signal in his processing. "That's," he started, stopped. "How did you model the enemy strike pattern?" "Open source data on regional Air Force development combined with pattern analysis of historical engagement data from declassified records." She paused. "In 4 months of running the scenario in the sim room." Mercer stared at her. "You've been using the sim room." "At night," Emma said. "When it's not scheduled." Another silence. Longer this time. Mercer looked at the hangar floor, then back at her. "Carter," he said, "you know I can't. I mean, there are channels. There are reasons those channels exist." "I know," Emma said. "I used all of them." He held her gaze, and she saw something move through his expression, that she hadn't expected, something that wasn't exactly guilt and wasn't exactly admiration, but lived somewhere in the uncomfortable space between them. "I'll look at it," he said. "I'm not promising anything, but I'll look at it." Emma nodded. "I have a copy," she said. "I always have a copy." She handed it to him. He took it. He folded it once and put it in the chest pocket of his flight suit, and Emma watched him walk away and thought, that is the first pilot at this base who has ever actually taken the paper from my hand. She didn't know yet what that would or wouldn't mean. She had learned not to build too much on small gestures. But she wrote it in her notebook that night, the date, the time, and 3 words Mercer took it. And then she went to the simulation room, and she ran the Northeast Corridor scenario for the 49th time. April brought 2 things to Eagle Ridge: a dust storm that lasted 4 days and kept the aircraft grounded, in a classified briefing that Emma was not allowed to attend. She knew about the briefing because she overheard part of the preparation for it. Logistics conversations, the kind that happened in hallways and weren't sufficiently guarded because the people having them didn't think about who might be walking past. She heard the words regional incursion, and she heard the words threat escalation, and she heard the phrase increased likelihood of airspace contact. And something cold moved through her in a way that had nothing to do with the dust-carrying desert wind. She went to Gloss. "Chief," she said, "I'd like to flag the maintenance status of several aircraft in the active rotation. I have specific concerns about the 217 and the 219 under high sortie conditions." Gloss looked at her over his clipboard. "They passed inspection. They passed the standard inspection. I have additional data on Carter. He set the clipboard down. You know what your problem is? You don't trust the system. Emma looked at him steadily. The system didn't prevent my father from dying because a component wasn't serviced. Gloss blinked. It was the first time she had ever said anything like that, and the surprise of it was visible on his face before his expression closed back down. I'm sorry about your father, he said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. But this is a different situation. Chief, Emma said, and her voice was very quiet. I need you to hear me. The 217 and the 219 have compound stress vulnerabilities that I have documented over 6 months. If those aircraft are assigned to active defensive sorties under the conditions I believe are coming, there will be a gap in the northeast sector that an adversary with the right tactical knowledge could exploit. I have run this scenario 49 times. The outcome is consistent. Gloss looked at her for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes. Then he looked away. Write it up, he said. I'll see it gets another look. Emma wrote it up. She wrote it up that same night, pulling together all her data, all her months of records, the clearest and most precise document she had ever produced. 8 pages. Every number sourced, every calculation shown, every assumption explicit and labeled as an assumption. She submitted it the next morning. 2 days later, she got it back with a single line written across the top in Patterson's handwriting, outside scope of maintenance function. Not forwarded. Emma sat with that paper in her hands for a long time. Then she folded it carefully, put it in her notebook, and went back to Bay 3. The dust storm had passed. The aircraft were cleared for flight, and somewhere in a classified briefing room on the other side of the base, decisions were being made about how to defend American airspace by people who had never once looked at what Emma Carter had spent 4 years learning to see. She picked up her wrench. She went back to work. She kept waiting. Emma Carter did not sleep that night, not because she was angry. Anger was something she had learned to metabolize a long time ago, to take it in, break it down, convert it into something useful. What kept her awake was not the rage of being dismissed. It was something colder and more precise. It was the certainty sitting in her chest like a stone that she was right, and that being right in this place at this moment was not enough, had never been enough, might never be enough. She lay on her bunk in the dark and stared at the ceiling and ran the northeast quarter scenario for the 50th time, not in the simulator, but in her head, the way she had learned to do it over years of practice, the entire engagement, playing out in the space behind her eyes like a film she had directed and memorized and could replay at will. The formation gap, the thermal stress on the 217 and the 219, the compression strike window, 8 minutes, maybe 11. If the atmospheric conditions were favorable, 8 to 11 minutes in which the entire eastern defensive corridor was in her models functionally open. She thought about her father. She thought about the accident report. She thought about the way the report had described the component failure in language so clinical and detached that you could almost forget it was a man's life. Being described a man who had known how to read the wind with his whole body, but had no way of knowing what was failing silently inside the machine that carried him. She got up at 4 in the morning. She went to the simulation room. She ran the scenario again, not the 50th time now, the 51st, and this time she deliberately modified the parameters to reflect the most recent atmospheric data she had pulled from the base weather records, which she had been monitoring for 3 weeks. She changed the thermal variables. She adjusted the formation positions to reflect the most current standard deployment protocol. The window was still there. If anything, it was slightly wider than her previous models had suggested. She sat in the simulator cockpit for a long time after the scenario ended in the dark and the quiet of 4:30 in the morning, with the screens powered down and the hum of the base's ventilation system, the only sound in the world. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She went completely still. Using the simulation room at night was something she had been doing for months without incident, but it was also something that could end her career at Eagle Ridge if the wrong person found her here. And after what had happened with Colonel Hale, she was acutely aware that the margin for error in her professional life had just gotten considerably thinner. The footsteps slowed outside the door, stopped. The door opened. Captain David Mercer stood in the doorway in civilian clothes, looking as surprised to see her as she was to see him. They stared at each other for a moment. "Carter," he said. "Sir," she said. He looked at the powered-down simulator. He looked at her. He looked at the notebook open on the console beside her, covered in her small, precise handwriting. He came in and closed the door behind him. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "4 months," she said. "Since I got here." Every night, most nights. He walked closer. He looked at the notebook without picking it up, reading what he could see of it. His expression was doing something complicated. "I read your report," he said. "The one you gave me. I read it 3 times." Emma watched him. And I think you might be right." He said it quietly, like he was admitting something. "About the gap, about the formation vulnerability. I ran some of it by a friend at Air Combat Command, informally, no names attached, and he said the pattern you identified was consistent with threat modeling he'd seen in classified briefings." Emma felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope. She was too careful with herself for hope, but something adjacent to it, something that sat up straighter and paid closer attention. "What did you do with that?" she asked. Mercer looked at the floor. "Nothing yet." The almost hope settled back down. "Why?" "Because," he said, and his voice had something frustrated in it, something that sounded like a man arguing with himself. "Because going to hell with information sourced from a maintenance specialist who's been running unauthorized night simulations is not a conversation I can win. That's not me dismissing you, Carter. That's me telling you the truth about how this institution works." "I know how it works," Emma said. "Then you know why." "I know why you haven't done anything," Emma said. "I also know that knowing why something doesn't happen doesn't change what happens." "Or what doesn't?" Mercer was quiet for a moment. He pulled over a chair and sat down across from her, which surprised her, the casual claiming of space in a room where he had no more official right to be than she did. "Tell me something," he said. "The 217 and the 219, your thermal stress model. Walk me through it." Emma looked at him steadily. Then she opened her notebook to the relevant page and she talked. She talked for 40 minutes. Mercer listened, actually listened, in the way she had learned to distinguish from performative attention, asking questions at the right moments, pushing back twice on points where her assumptions were contestable, acknowledging both times when her counter-argument held. He wasn't being kind, he was being rigorous. And rigorous was something Emma Carter had been waiting for someone to be with her work for 4 years. When she finished, Mercer sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "If you're right about the formation gap," he said slowly, "and if the 217 and 219 assigned to the Northeast Corridor in an active engagement scenario, the gap opens," Emma said. "Every model I have says the same thing." "How confident are you?" She met his eyes. "Completely." The word landed in the room like something solid. Mercer looked at her and she saw him deciding something. "I'm going to try one more time," he said. "Through proper channels. I'll put my name on it, this time frame it as my own tactical concern source, the maintenance data, without specifying who flagged it. It's not ideal, and I know that, and I'm sorry for that, but it's what I can actually get in front of Hale." Emma thought about this. It was not the right answer. It was, as far as she could tell, the only available answer. "Okay," she said. "If it goes nowhere," he started. "It'll go nowhere," Emma said, not bitterly, just factually, the way she had learned to state difficult things. "But try anyway." Mercer nodded. He stood up. He looked at her notebook one more time. "Carter," he said at the door, "how many times have you run that Northeast Corridor scenario?" 51, she said. He was quiet for a second. Then he shook his head very slightly, in a way that she couldn't quite read, and walked out into the corridor and was gone. Emma sat in the dark simulation room for another 10 minutes. Then she went back to the barracks, lay down on her bunk, and slept for 2 hours. It was the most she had slept in 3 days. She wrote in her notebook before she closed her eyes. "Mercer, April 14th, he's going to try a wiki. It won't work, but he's going to try, and underneath that one more line 51 times. The window is still there. Mercer tried on April 16th. Emma knew he had tried because she saw him come out of Hale's office at 11:40 in the morning, with his jaw set in the particular way that faces set when a man has said everything he had to say, and none of it has mattered. He didn't look for her. She happened to see him from across the hangar through the gap between 2 aircraft, and she watched the way he walked, not defeated exactly, but recalibrated, the way people walk when they've confirmed something they already knew. She went back to her work. She had the 217 on the maintenance schedule that afternoon. She went over it with a precision that went considerably beyond what the checklist required, documenting every anomaly she found, every measurement that deviated from factory specification, every indicator that her thermal stress model was continuing to progress exactly as she had predicted. She had 12 pages of documentation on the 217 alone. 12 pages that lived in her notebook and nowhere else, because nowhere else had been willing to hold them. Gloss came by at 3 that afternoon. He stood and watched her work for a moment, which was unusual. "Heard there was another conversation with command about your analysis," he said. Emma didn't look up. "Heard it the same way I heard the first one. Sideways." "Carter." Something in his voice made her stop and look at him. He was not a bad man, Gloss. She had decided that a long time ago. He was a man who had spent 22 years learning the shape of the institution and filling it the way water fills whatever container it's given. "I want you to be careful." "I'm always careful." "I mean," he glanced around the hangar, lowering his voice slightly. "Hale doesn't forget when someone makes him feel like he's missing something. That's not a man who takes correction well. And after the report incident, he threw my work out a window," Emma said, "in front of witnesses." "I know. That's not a me problem, Chief." "No," Gloss said quietly, "but the consequences will be." He looked at her for a moment longer. "Just keep your head down. Do good work. Let it go." Emma looked at the fuel line connector she was holding in her hands. The same connector she had been flagging for 6 months. The microfracture visible to her now as clearly as a crack in glass. "I can't let it go," she said, "because if I let it go, someone is going to get hurt." Gloss didn't say anything else. He walked away, and Emma went back to work, holding the connector in her hands and thinking about the gap that was still there, that had always been there, that no one with the power to close it was willing to look at. It was 2 days later when everything changed. The alert came at 2 in the morning. Not a drill, not a test, the real thing, the kind of alert that sent the entire base from sleep to motion in under 4 minutes. Emma was already awake. She had been in the simulation room running the Northeast Corridor scenario for the 54th time, and she felt the change in the base before she heard it, the shift in the quality of the sound, the quality of the light, the specific frequency of movement that meant something real was happening. She came out of the simulation room into the corridor just as base personnel were moving at pace toward their stations, and she caught a fragment of conversation from 2 officers passing her, multiple contacts, and restricted airspace, and Northeast Corridor, and the stone in her chest became something harder and colder and more absolute. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds. Then she moved. The base command center was not somewhere Emma Carter had ever had reason to be. It was 3 buildings from the operations center, access controlled, populated exclusively by flight officers and command personnel, and the intelligence specialists who fed them information in real time. It was not a place for maintenance crew. It was not a place for Emma. She went there anyway. The corridor outside was controlled by an airman she didn't know, young, tightly wound, with the specific tension of someone whose night had just become significantly more complicated than expected. "Ma'am, this area is... I need to speak to whoever is coordinating the intercept formation," Emma said. "Right now." "Ma'am, I can't let you." "The 217 and the 219 are in the active rotation," Emma said. "They have documented system vulnerabilities that I have been trying to flag for 6 months. If they are assigned to the Northeast Corridor in the current formation, you are going to have a gap in your defensive coverage that the contacts you're tracking will find inside 8 minutes. I need to speak to someone. Right now." The airman stared at her. "How do you know about..." "Because I've been running the scenario for 3 months, Emma said. 54 times. Let me in." "I can't let you in without authorization." Emma looked at him for 1 second. Then she said, "Then get me someone who can authorize it. And do it fast, because the clock is already running." The airman picked up his radio. His voice had changed, not convinced, but uncertain enough to act, which was all Emma needed. She waited in the corridor. She had nothing in her hands. No folder, no report, no 7 pages of calculations. Everything she knew she carried inside her, and right now, what she knew felt like it was pressing against the inside of her ribs, trying to get out, trying to matter the way it had been trying to matter for 4 years. The radio crackled. A pause. Another crackle. Then the door opened. Captain David Mercer stood on the other side of it. He looked at her face and something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like recognition, like a man who had been told it was going to rain and was now watching the first drops fall. "Tell me what you know," he said. "Quickly," Emma told him. Standing at the doorway, 30 seconds every critical element, no preamble, no apology. The 217, the 219, the Northeast Corridor gap, the 8-minute window, the compression strike pattern that would exploit it. Mercer listened. His face was tight controlled, the face of a pilot running calculations. "The 217 is already assigned to the Northeast Corridor," he said. The stone in Emma's chest contracted. "Who's flying it?" "Morrison." "Is the 219 in the formation?" "Second position." Emma closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. "You need to pull them. Reassign the Northeast sector. The formation, as currently configured, has a gap that—" "I know," Mercer said. "I read your report, Carter. I read it 3 times. I believed you then." He paused. "I still believe you." Then, "I can't pull 2 aircraft from an active intercept formation based on the analysis of a maintenance specialist," he'd said. "Not without I need Hale to authorize it." "Hale won't." "I know what Hale will do," Mercer said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that wasn't composed or controlled. "But he's the commanding officer. I don't have a choice." Emma looked at him. She looked at the door behind him. She looked at his face, the face of a man who believed her, who had always believed her, who was being crushed between what he knew and what the institution allowed him to do with knowing it. "Then ask him," she said. "Ask him right now, and when he says no," she paused, "ask him to let me in." Mercer stared at her. "That's not—" "Ask him," Emma said. "Let him say it to my face this time. Not a folder in a trash can, not a message through Patterson. Let Colonel Marcus Hale look at me and tell me I'm wrong while enemy aircraft are in American airspace." A silence. The corridor hummed with the contained urgency of the entire base operating at emergency tempo around them. Somewhere in the building behind Mercer, voices were talking over each other. Radars were painting the sky, the intercept formation was being finalized, and 2 aircraft with documented vulnerabilities were being assigned to the exact position that Emma Carter's 54 simulations said would break. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," he said. "And Carter, whatever happens in this room in the next 2 minutes, don't flinch." Emma Carter walked into the command center, and the first person she saw was Colonel Marcus Hale standing at the central display table, his back to the door, watching the radar feeds with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about anything, or if he had never been required to know it. He heard the door. He turned. He saw Mercer first. Then he saw Emma. His face did something that began as confusion and moved quickly through irritation towards something that had no clean name, something that was partly rage and partly something else, something she had seen before in the faces of people who were about to realize something they didn't want to realize. "What is she doing in here?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "Sir." Mercer said, "I need 60 seconds of your time." Mercer. 60 seconds, sir, the Northeast Corridor, the 217 and 219. There is a documented system vulnerability that affects their combat performance under the current atmospheric conditions, and I believe it creates an exploitable gap in the formation that— "We have been through this," Hale said, each word separate, weighted. "We have been through this more than once, Captain, and I am not going to stand here during an active—" "Sir." Emma's voice. Quiet, not deferential, just quiet. "The contacts you're tracking, what formation are they flying?" Hale turned to her. The look on his face was something she felt physically. "Sergeant Carter," he said, "you have exactly 5 seconds to explain why you are in this room before I have you." "What formation?" Emma said again. Not louder, not softer, the same voice. "Because if it's a split compression strike with a leading faint element, the Northeast Corridor gap will open in approximately 8 minutes from the point of formation commitment, and the 217 and 219 will not be able to compensate due to the thermal stress degradation I have been documenting for 6 months." The room went very still. Not because everyone had agreed with her, not because everyone suddenly believed her. The room went still because something in the specificity of what she said, the flatness of it, the precision, the complete absence of plea or performance, landed in the space between certainty and doubt, And every person in that room who was honest enough to feel it, felt it. One of the intelligence officers at the radar display turned around slowly. He was looking at the screen. Then he looked at Emma. Then he looked at Hale. "Sir," he said, his voice was careful. "The contact formation, it is a split compression pattern. 2 leading elements and a faint cluster at bearing 273. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Emma counted them. Hale looked at the radar display. He looked at Emma. He looked at Mercer. His face was doing something she had never seen it do before, not doubt exactly, not belief, but the first crack in the absolute certainty that had let him throw her work out a window without reading a word of it. "How do you know that pattern?" Hale said. His voice had changed. "I built the scenario," Emma said, 54 times. "I built it because the data I had access to, open source historical analysis, threat development pattern, pointed to this exact configuration as the highest probability offensive approach against our current defensive posture." Hale stared at her. "Without access to classified threat assessments," he said slowly. "Yes, sir. And you're telling me your model matches what's on that screen? I'm telling you to pull the 217 and 219 from the northeast corridor and reassign the formation before the window opens." She paused. "Sir." Another silence. Every person in the room was watching Hale, and Hale was doing something Emma had not been sure he was capable of. He was thinking, not reacting, not dismissing, thinking. Then he said in a voice that was still tight, with something still fighting, something, "Can you prove the gap you're describing?" Emma looked at him. "Put me in the cockpit," she said, and the room stopped breathing. Mercer had gone completely still. The intelligence officer at the radar display had stopped typing. Even the ventilation system seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was listening. Hale looked at her for a very long time. "You're a mechanic," he said. "I'm the person who has been flying that corridor in simulation for 3 months, Emma said. "And I'm the only person in this building who has run this specific engagement scenario enough times to know exactly where it breaks and exactly how to close it." Hale looked at the radar. The contacts were moving. The clock was running. The window she had predicted was exactly as far away as her model said it would be. "Sir," Mercer said quietly, "she's right about the formation pattern. She was right about the 217. She was right about the gap." He paused. "She's been right about everything." The words fell into the room and stayed there. Hale's jaw worked. Emma watched the war on his face, not just a tactical calculation, but something older and harder than tactics. The war between what he was required by everything he believed about himself to say and what the radar screen and the woman standing in front of him were together forcing him to consider. He turned back to the display. He looked at the contacts. He looked at the clock. Then Colonel Marcus Hale, decorated Air Force commander, said 4 words that had never once in his career come easily. "Can you really fly?" Emma Carter did not blink. "Yes," she said, "I can." The silence lasted 6 seconds. Emma knew because she counted them the way she counted everything, not from nervousness, but from the same instinct that had always made her measure the world precisely because precise measurements were the only things that didn't lie to you. 6 seconds of Colonel Marcus Hale looking at her face and the radar screen and her face again, while every person in the command center held perfectly still and the contacts on the display kept moving, kept closing, kept making the decision for all of them, whether they were ready for it or not. Then Hale turned to the officer on his left. "Get me Morrison on the radio." The officer moved. Hale looked at Mercer. "What's her flight time?" "Simulation," Mercer said. "Extensive simulation. She's been running the Northeast Corridor scenario for 3 months. 54 iterations." "That's not what I asked." "Sir." Mercer held Hale's gaze. "It's the only answer there is." Another second. Hale's jaw was tight enough that Emma could see the muscle working at the corner of it. He was not a man who liked being forced into corners. He was not a man who liked admitting that a corner existed. But the radar screen in front of him was doing something that no amount of institutional authority could argue with. It was showing him exactly what Emma Carter had told him it would show him, with a precision that made the hair on the back of his neck do something he would never in his life describe out loud. "Morrison," the radio officer said. "Sir Morrison's reporting a pressure irregularity on the 217. He's requesting a systems check before him." Hale held up one hand. He closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them and looked at Emma with an expression that had no precedent in the 4 years she had spent at this base. Not warmth, not apology, not anything that simple. It was the expression of a man absorbing the weight of a very large mistake without yet knowing how to carry it. "Sergeant Carter," he said, "if I put you in that aircraft, and I am not saying I am putting you in that aircraft, and you get it wrong." "I won't get it wrong," Emma said. "That is exactly what every pilot who has ever gotten it wrong has said." "With respect, sir," Emma said, "none of them spent 3 months building the scenario from the other side." The radio crackled again. The intelligence officer at the display turned around with his face careful, and his voice more careful still. "Sir, the contact formation is committing. They're past the decision point. The faint element is separating." Hale looked at the display. He looked at Emma. He looked at Mercer. "How long?" he said, to Emma, not to the intelligence officer, to Emma. 7 minutes, she said, maybe 7.5. The atmospheric conditions today are running slightly cooler than my baseline model, which widens the window marginally. But the commitment pattern is exactly what I projected, which means the northeast gap opens in 7 minutes, regardless of what we do with the formation, unless we act right now. Hale stood completely still for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Mercer, you're in the lead. Carter goes up in the 219. You cover her until she's established in the northeast sector. After that," he stopped. He looked at Emma. "After that, you follow her lead." Mercer blinked. "Sir, you heard me?" Hale's voice was flat and final. The voice of a man who had made the decision and was not going to revisit it because revisiting it would require acknowledging how close he had come to not making it. "Move, both of you, now!" Emma was already moving. She had never run into the command center. She ran now through the door and into the corridor and out into the sharp cold of the Nevada night with Mercer half a step behind her, and the sound of the base at full emergency tempo was everywhere around them. Engines' voices, the deep mechanical urgency of aircraft being readied, and Emma Carter was running toward a fighter jet that she had never flown outside of a simulation, toward an engagement she had modeled 54 times. Toward the moment that everything she had taught herself in stolen hours in a dark room at 4 in the morning was either going to be enough or it wasn't. "Carter," Mercer beside her, slightly breathless. "Talk to me. What's your actual stick time?" "0, she said, running. "0. He repeated it like he was making sure he'd heard correctly. As in the simulators at Eagle Ridge are calibrated to within 0.3% of actual flight performance, she said. "And I have over 400 hours in them, and I know the 219's control response profile better than I know my own handwriting. So yes, 0 actual stick time, but that number is less meaningful than you think." Mercer was quiet for 2 strides. Then, "It better be." The flight crew had the 219 on the line. Emma suited up with the speed of someone who had mentally rehearsed this sequence, the G-suit, the harness, the helmet. Because she had mentally rehearsed it, of course she had the same way she had mentally rehearsed it everything. One of the ground crew, a young specialist named Torres, who had worked in Emma's bay for 3 months, saw her coming, and his face did something extraordinary. It moved from professional focus to complete disbelief and back to professional focus in about 1.5 seconds. "Sergeant Carter," Torres said. "She's cleared," Mercer said from behind her. "Get her in." Torres looked at Emma. Emma looked at Torres. Something passed between them. Not words, just recognition. The particular recognition of 2 people who have worked side by side for months without ever having a conversation that mattered and are suddenly in a moment that matters enormously. "The starboard fuel flow regulator," Torres said quickly, quietly. "It's been running 2% high since Tuesday. I flagged it, but it hasn't been adjusted yet. Compensate on your throttle settings in the first climb." 2% high, Emma said. "Noted." Torres nodded once, and then he was helping her up the ladder, and she was climbing into the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor, and the world contracted to the size of that cockpit, to the feel of the seat and the familiar geography of the instrument panel that she knew as well as the layout of her own barracks room, and the canopy came down around her and sealed, and she was alone. She took one breath. Just one. She thought about her father banking over the potato fields in the early morning light, reading the wind with his whole body. She thought about the accident report. She thought about 14 years old and the decision she had made, quiet and absolute, about what her life was going to be for. Then she put the thought away. She didn't need it anymore. She had already made all the decisions that needed to be made. Everything that came next was execution. 219, this is Tower. You are cleared for emergency departure runway 22. Winds are 270 at 12. Mercer, you are lead. Carter. A pause, the kind of pause that contained an entire institutional crisis compressed into half a second. Carter, you are authorized. Call the ball. 219 copies, Emma said. Her voice was completely steady. She taxied. She ran her checks, not the abbreviated checks of someone in a hurry, but the precise and complete checks of someone who understood exactly what she was about to ask this machine to do and needed every system confirmed before she asked it. Torres's note about the fuel flow regulator accounted for. The thermal stress indicators on the airframe within acceptable range for the engagement duration she was projecting. The weapon system's active verified green across the board. 6 minutes to window opening. She rolled onto the runway. Mercer was ahead of her, his aircraft's running lights steady in the dark. She heard his voice in her helmet. Carter, stay tight on my 6 until we're established. Then you have the lead in the northeast sector. I'll cover your flanks. Copy, Emma said. And Carter? A pause. She could hear him choosing words. You've been the smartest person at this base for 4 years. Time to prove it out loud. She didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to say to it that wouldn't take longer than they had. She pushed the throttle forward. The F-22 moved, and then it accelerated. And then it was doing the thing that no simulator had ever fully replicated, the physical insistence of it, the G-forces pressing her into the seat as the runway disappeared beneath her, and the desert fell away, and the night sky opened up in every direction, enormous and indifferent and perfect. Her body processed it and adjusted with a speed that surprised even her, the proprioceptive sense of the aircraft's attitude, the feel of the controls. The way the aircraft wanted to move versus the way she needed it to move. The simulator had been better preparation than anyone would have believed, but it had not been the same thing. The same thing was this weight and noise and speed and consequence. She leveled at altitude. Mercer's aircraft was 300 meters to her left, and slightly ahead, a shape in the darkness marked by its lights. Carter, Tower said, contacts bearing 045 range 60 miles closing. Confirm you have the picture. Emma checked her display. The contacts were exactly where her model said they would be in the formation she had projected, executing the compression strike pattern she had built her scenarios around for 3 months. The faint element was separating to the southwest, exactly as she'd told Hale it would. The primary strike elements were holding their bearing, pushing toward the northeast corridor. Toward the gap that was going to open in, she checked 5 minutes and 40 seconds. I have the picture, Emma said. Mercer, the faint element that is going to try to draw us southwest. Do not follow it. It's a bait. The real pressure is going to come from 045 and 062, simultaneously timed to hit the corridor while we're displaced. You're sure, Mercer said. I've watched them do it 54 times, Emma said. Yes, I'm sure. A beat. Then lead is yours, Carter. Talk me through it. She talked him through it. Not the way she talked in reports, not the careful, documented sourced language of someone trying to convince a skeptical institution. The real thing, the live thing, the way the scenario played in her head in real time as the aircraft moved and the contacts moved, and the gap in the northeast corridor counted down toward the moment it would either be closed or exploited. Southwest feint is going to commit in 90 seconds, she said. When it does hold your position, I'm going to push northeast and close the gap before the primary elements reach it. Once I'm established, the compression geometry breaks. They can't execute the strike without the timing window, and I'm going to take the window away from them. And if they adjust, Mercer said, they'll have 2 options, Emma said. Break off or commit to a direct engagement on unfavorable terms. Either one is a win. You sound very calm, Mercer said. I've done this before, Emma said. In a simulator? Yes, Emma said. In a simulator. 54 times. The 55th time is right now. The Southwest feint committed. Emma watched it on her display and held her position, and she heard the tower beginning to call. The feint movement with rising urgency. Contacts bearing 230 range 40 closing. Mercer Carter, the Southwest element is. And she said flat and clear, hold, it's a bait, hold. Mercer held. The feint pushed. It pushed hard, crossing inside 40 miles, the kind of aggressive approach that was designed to make defensive pilots react to pull them out of position to create the displacement that would open the corridor. It was a good tactic. It was a well-executed tactic. It was a tactic that would have worked perfectly against the standard formation response. Emma Carter was not giving a standard formation response. "Northeast now," she said. "I'm going." She pushed the throttle and turned northeast and felt the aircraft accelerate into the corridor with an authority that was in that moment one of the most physical sensations she had ever experienced. Not just the G-forces, but the absolute rightness of moving in exactly the direction her model said to move, at exactly the moment her model said to move there, because 54 iterations had made the geometry of this engagement as familiar to her as the layout of Bay 3. The primary strike elements saw her coming. She watched the formation on her display shift, the slight hesitation, the adjustment, the moment when the tactical picture changed for the people on the other side of the radar, because the defensive response was not what they had projected. "They're adjusting," Mercer said. He was watching from the southwest, holding his position, covering her flanks. "Primary elements are they're splitting. 045 element is pushing. 062 is pulling back." 045 is the aggressive element, Emma said. "They're going to try to force me out of the corridor by direct pressure. Let them try." "Carter, they're closing fast." "I know," she said. "Let them try." What happened in the next 4 minutes would be replayed in briefings for years afterward. Not because it was the most technically complex aerial engagement in recent history, it wasn't. Not because the aircraft involved were performing beyond their specifications, they weren't. It would be replayed because of the decisions, because of the sequence of choices made by the pilot of the 219 in the Northeast Corridor. Choices that were so precisely calibrated to the actual behavior of the adversarial formation that the debrief analysts would note again and again that the defensive response appeared to anticipate the offensive adjustments before they were executed. Appeared to anticipate them, because Emma Carter had in fact anticipated them. All of them. In a dark simulation room at 4 a.m. for 3 months. Because she had understood something that the institution around her had never given her credit for. Understanding that the best tactical mind in the engagement was not the one with the most rank, or the most official training, or the most medals. It was the one who had looked at the problem the most times from the most angles, with the most honest willingness to see what was actually there instead of what they expected to find. The 045 element pushed. Emma did not flinch, did not displace, held the corridor with a precision that closed the gap she had been warning about for 6 months to exactly 0, and the compression strike timing that the adversarial formation had been built around dissolved because the window it required no longer existed. 062 is breaking off, Mercer said. His voice had something in it she had not heard from him before. 045 is they're pulling back. Carter, they're pulling back. Emma watched the contacts on her display. The primary strike elements were disengaging the formation, unwinding the compression geometry collapsing, as the timing window closed and the tactical logic that had depended on it ceased to hold. The southwest faint element, no longer able to fulfill its role in a strike that wasn't happening, turned and followed. "Tower, this is Carter," Emma said. "Northeast corridor is secure. Contacts are withdrawing on all bearings. Formation integrity is holding." The silence from the tower lasted longer than any operational silence should have. "Then copy 219, we copy." Emma throttled back. She held her altitude and her heading and let the adrenaline process through her system, the way she had taught herself to process difficult things, not suppressing it, not performing it, just letting it move through and settle. Her hands on the controls were completely steady. They had been completely steady for the entire engagement. She had not in 4 minutes of live aerial combat experienced a single moment of doubt. Because doubt was what happened when you didn't know what you were doing, and Emma Carter had known exactly what she was doing since the 51st time she had run this scenario in a dark room at Eagle Ridge Air Force Base, while the pilot slept and the institution that employed her remained entirely unaware of what it had. "Carter." Mercer's voice. Something in it she couldn't quite categorize, something that was working very hard to stay inside the boundaries of professional communication and not entirely succeeding. "Mercer," she said. "That was, well," he stopped, started again. "That was the most precise defensive engagement I have ever seen executed in a live environment." Emma was quiet for a moment. She looked at the display, at the retreating contacts, at the clean and empty northeast corridor, that she had just held with an aircraft she had never physically flown against, an adversary she had modeled from open-source data in a simulation room she wasn't supposed to be using. "I know," she said quietly. Not arrogance, just truth. The same flat, precise truth she had always offered, the only kind she knew how to give. "Tower," she said, 219 requesting return to base. 219, you are cleared. Runway 22, and Carter. Another pause. She was getting used to the pauses. The CO wants a word when you're down. Of course he does, Emma thought. She turned the aircraft toward home. The landing was smooth. Not perfect by simulation standards, the physical reality of the runway, the crosswind that was slightly stronger than the weather data had projected, the 2% fuel flow irregularity that Torres had warned her about, but smooth controlled the kind of landing that came from understanding the aircraft from the inside, from having read its technical documentation until she could recite the hydraulic response curves from memory. From 400 hours of simulation that had prepared her for exactly this, for the 55th iteration, for the one that was real. She taxied to the line. The canopy opened. The night air hit her face, cold and immediate and real in a way that the pressurized cockpit had filtered away. Torres was there. He caught the canopy rail as she climbed down the ladder, and he looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face in 3 months of working beside him, something open and unguarded and almost undone. "Sergeant Carter," he said, and then he couldn't seem to find what came after that. 2% fuel flow, Emma said. "Thank you for the heads up." Torres nodded. He looked like he might say something else. Then he stepped back, and Emma saw what was behind him. The ground crew. Every member of the night maintenance team, 12 people who had watched her climb into the 219 40 minutes ago, with expressions ranging from disbelief to alarm. They were standing in a loose group on the tarmac, and none of them were moving, and they were all looking at her. Emma looked back at them. Nobody said anything, but something happened, quiet, immediate, wordless. A kind of acknowledgement that didn't require language, because language would have been insufficient to carry it. One of the crew members, a woman named Diaz, who had never once in 3 months said anything to Emma beyond what was operationally necessary, put her hand briefly on Emma's shoulder as she walked past. Just that, just a hand on a shoulder for 2 seconds. Emma felt it for a long time after it was gone. Mercer caught up with her as she walked toward the operations building, still in her flight suit, still carrying the weight of the engagement in her body, the way physical experience settles differently than simulation. "Hale wants to debrief in 10 minutes, Mercer said. He was walking beside her, not behind her. That was different. That was new. "I know," Emma said. "Carter." He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. His face in the tarmac lights was doing something complicated, not guilt exactly, but the first cousin of it, the expression of a man who had believed the right thing and still not done enough with believing it. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the 4 months I had your report and didn't push harder." Emma looked at him. She thought about what to say. She thought about the folder in the trash in the corridor outside the briefing room, and Gloss telling her to keep her head down, and Patterson writing outside scope of maintenance function in handwriting, so controlled it looked like it didn't cost him anything. "You got me in the room," she said. "Tonight, when it mattered." "That's a very generous accounting," Mercer said. "It's an accurate one," Emma said. "I'm always accurate." Something moved across his face that was briefly almost a smile. Then it settled into something more serious. "Hale's not going to enjoy this debrief," he said. "No," Emma agreed. "He's going to be in a room where he has to confront the fact that he was wrong. Not just wrong about tonight, wrong about the 217, wrong about the report, wrong about..." Mercer stopped. "Wrong about me," Emma said. "Yes." Emma started walking again. "Good," she said. "He should be in that room. It's the only place where anything changes." They walked into the operations building, and the corridor was different than it had been 40 minutes ago, when Emma had run through it toward an aircraft and an engagement, in a moment her whole life had been without her fully knowing it, preparing her for. The same corridor, the same walls, the same ventilation hum, but different because she was different in it, and the people around her were different in response to what she was. And the space between those two things, between what she had always been and what the institution was only now being forced to see, that space was beginning slowly, painfully, irreversibly to close. Colonel Marcus Hale was waiting in the debrief room. He was standing at the end of the table, not sitting in the posture of a man who needed to be standing for what was coming. His face was controlled in the way faces are controlled when the controlling is costing something. Emma walked in. She stood across the table from him. They looked at each other. Hale spoke first. "The engagement outcome," he started. "Sir," Emma said quietly, "I don't need you to explain the outcome to me. I was there." A silence. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite humility, not yet. But the first movement in that direction, the first acknowledgement that the ground had changed under both of them and that neither of them could pretend anymore. It was the same ground it had been this morning. "The 219 sustained no damage," Hale said. "No American aircraft were lost. The adversarial formation withdrew without achieving any of its apparent objectives." He paused. "Your engagement tactics have been recorded in full and will be subject to formal debrief and analysis." "I understand," Emma said. "The Northeast Corridor vulnerability you identified." He stopped. He looked at the table surface for 1 second, then he looked back at her. "It was real. Your model was accurate. The documentation you submitted over the previous 6 months, the maintenance flags, the thermal stress analysis, the data was valid." Emma waited. "I should have," Hale started. "Sir," Emma said, and she said it gently not to spare him, but because she was, despite everything, a person who understood that being wrong and knowing it was its own kind of weight. "There will be time for that conversation. Right now, I'd like to know about the 217. Morrison, did he get down safely?" Hale looked at her. Something in his expression cracked very slightly, like the surface of ice when the temperature finally changes. "He did," Hale said. "The pressure irregularity resolved on descent. He's down." Emma let out a breath she hadn't quite known she was holding. "Good," she said. "That's what matters." And she meant it. She had always meant it. That was the thing that had never changed through 4 years of closed doors and thrown folders, an outside scope of maintenance function, written in handwriting that tried not to cost anything. It had never been about being right. It had never been about being seen. It had been about the aircraft landing safely. About the pilot coming home. About the component not failing in the field 3 miles from where a 14-year-old girl sat on a fence and watched the sky. That was what it had always been about. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly in a way that was different from every nod she had received from every senior officer in 4 years at Eagle Ridge. Different because it was not the nod of someone performing acknowledgement, but the nod of someone genuinely giving it. "Sergeant Carter," he said, "you are to remain on base pending a formal review of tonight's engagement. Flight status will be addressed as part of that review." He paused. "You will be present for all debrief sessions." "Yes, sir," Emma said. She turned to leave. "Carter." She stopped, turned back. Hale was looking at her with an expression she would spend a long time afterward trying to put words to. Not apology, not admiration. Something harder and more honest than either the look of a man standing in the rubble of a certainty he'd built his whole professional identity on trying to figure out what to build next. "How many times," he said, "did you run that scenario?" Emma looked at him. 54, she said, "before tonight." She walked out of the debrief room, down the corridor, and into the cold Nevada air. Above her, the sky was full of stars, enormous, indifferent, and absolutely indifferent to rank. She stood on the tarmac for a moment alone and looked up at them. She thought about her father. She thought about the wind. She thought about a 14-year-old girl who had made a quiet and absolute decision about what her life was going to mean. She thought about the notebook in her chest pocket, full of numbers that had been right all along, and then she went back to Bay 3, because the aircraft still needed to be maintained, because the work didn't stop, because the engagement was over. Because Emma Carter had always understood that the most important work was the work that happened before anyone was watching. She picked up her wrench, and she went back to it. She was back in Bay 3 by 5:15 in the morning, not because anyone told her to be, not because the maintenance schedule required it, but because Bay 3 was the one place at Eagle Ridge Air Force Base where Emma Carter had always known exactly what she was and exactly what she was doing, and after a night that had rewritten every other coordinate in her world, she needed one thing that was still the same shape it had been yesterday. She picked up her wrench. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. She began her morning inspection on the 219 with the same precision she brought to every inspection, The same discipline, the same refusal to let the previous 12 hours mean that the work in front of her deserved anything less than her full attention. Torres found her there at 5:40. He stood in the bay entrance for a moment, watching her work before he said anything. "You know, you don't have to do this right now," he said. "I know," Emma said. "Most people after what you just did would be, I don't know, somewhere else." "The 219 needs a post-flight inspection," Emma said. "It flew a combat engagement 4 hours ago. The inspection doesn't care what the pilot did before she landed." Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he walked in and picked up his own clipboard and started on the port side without being asked. They worked in silence for a while, the comfortable silence of two people who had spent months in the same physical space and had developed, without ever naming it, a professional rhythm that was its own form of communication. "Diaz told everyone," Torres said eventually, "about what happened. I mean, the tower crew told the line crew and it moved fast. Everyone knows." Emma didn't look up from the connector she was examining. "I figured." "Carter," he stopped. She could hear him choosing words the way Mercer had chosen words, carefully aware that the ordinary vocabulary wasn't quite adequate. "What you did tonight, people are going to be talking about it for a long time." "People talk," Emma said. "The aircraft still needs to be inspected." Torres laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh, the kind that comes out when something is genuinely unexpected. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, it does." They finished the inspection at 6:50. Emma wrote the last notation in her log, closed her notebook, and was preparing to start on the adjacent aircraft when Chief Petty Officer Gloss appeared in the bay entrance. He was in his dress uniform, which he never wore for morning rounds. Emma registered that detail immediately. "Carter," he said. His voice was different. Not softer exactly, but more careful, the way voices get when people are navigating something they don't have established protocol for. "Command wants you in the main briefing room at 0700. Dress uniform." Emma looked at him. "Am I being disciplined?" Gloss held her gaze. "No," he said. Then after a pause that cost him something, "You are not." She nodded. "I'll need 20 minutes. "You have 30, Gloss said. And then he did something he had never once done in 4 years and 2 months and 17 days. He looked at her directly without the clipboard between them, without the procedural distance of superior and subordinate. And he said, "Carter, I owe you an apology. I should have pushed harder on those maintenance reports. I knew you were right about the 217. I knew it, and I let the chain of command be an excuse." Emma stood with her wrench still in her hand and looked at him. "Chief," she said, "why are you telling me this now?" "Because Gloss said there are going to be investigators in that briefing room asking questions about the last 6 months, and I intend to tell them the truth, and I thought you should hear it from me first." Emma was still for a moment. Then as she set the wrench down on the workbench very carefully, with the same precision she used for everything. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was exactly what she said. It was an acknowledgement, honest and plain, from a woman who had learned a long time ago that the truth was the only currency that didn't depreciate. The briefing room at 0700 was not the room Emma had expected. She had expected a debrief room, familiar, functional, the kind of military space that existed to process events and produce documentation. What she walked into was a room with 4 people she had never seen before, sitting at one side of a long table, each with a legal pad and a recording device, and Colonel Marcus Hale sitting at the end, in a posture that communicated with extraordinary precision a man who had slept for 2 hours and spent both of them awake. Mercer was there too. He stood along the wall, not seated, arms crossed, with the careful stillness of someone who had decided to be present as a witness, regardless of whether he'd been officially invited to be. One of the 4 strangers, a woman in her mid-50s in a civilian suit that somehow communicated more authority than any uniform in the room, looked at Emma as she entered and said, "Sergeant Carter, please sit down. My name is Dr. Adrian Walsh. I'm with the Inspector General's office. This is not a disciplinary proceeding. I want to be clear about that from the start." Emma sat down. She placed her notebook on the table in front of her and folded her hands on top of it. "How long have you been at Eagle Ridge?" Walsh asked. 4 years, 2 months, and 18 days, Emma said. Walsh noted something on her pad. "And in that time, how many formal reports did you submit regarding aircraft maintenance vulnerabilities that you believed fell outside the parameters addressed by standard inspection protocols?" Emma opened her notebook. She had the number ready because of course she did. 14, she said. beginning with a microfracture analysis on the 217 submitted in my 6th week at this base. I have copies of all 14 submissions and their dispositions. Walsh looked at the notebook. You kept copies. I keep copies of everything, Emma said. I have for 4 years. Something moved across Walsh's face, not quite surprise, but the expression of someone who has walked into a room expecting to excavate and discovered that the subject has already done the excavation and organized the findings by date. May I? Walsh extended her hand toward the notebook. Emma slid it across the table. Walsh opened it. She read in silence for approximately 45 seconds, and Emma watched the quality of that silence change as Walsh moved through the pages, the way the silence deepened and became something more weighted, something that had consequences attached to it. Walsh passed the notebook to the person on her left without looking up. She looked at Emma. These maintenance flags, the thermal stress analysis, the formation vulnerability documentation. She paused. You developed this analysis independently, without access to classified threat assessments. Yes, Emma said, using publicly available data, open source threat development analysis, historical engagement records from declassified sources and pattern modeling. I built myself based on 4 months of simulation study. Emma paused. I can walk you through the methodology if you'd like. Walsh looked at her for a long moment. I would like that very much, she said. But first I want to understand something. She leaned forward slightly. You submitted these reports through proper channels. They were not actioned. Why did you keep submitting them? Emma looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Walsh directly. Because I knew I was right, she said. And because knowing you're right and staying quiet about it, when the consequence of staying quiet is that someone gets hurt, that's not something I'm capable of. She paused. My father was a pilot. He died because a component failed that should have been caught. I have spent my career making sure that doesn't happen to someone else. I don't know how to stop doing that because the institution finds it inconvenient. The room was very quiet. Hale at the end of the table was looking at the surface in front of him with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to remain neutral. Walsh wrote something on her legal pad. Sergeant Carter, she said, I need to tell you something that may be relevant to your understanding of what happens next. She glanced at the people beside her, and something passed between them that was professional and quick, and communicated a decision already made. Your formation vulnerability analysis, the Northeast Corridor gap documentation. Specifically, the model you developed for the compression strike scenario has been reviewed this morning by 2 analysts from the Pentagon's Air Threat Assessment Division. Emma waited. Their assessment, Walsh said, is that your model matches to a statistically significant degree classified threat projection models that were developed using intelligence resources you had absolutely no access to. The silence that followed was the longest one in the room so far. Emma heard Mercer shift his weight against the wall. She heard Hale set something down on the table. She kept her eyes on Walsh. How close a match? Emma asked. Close enough, Walsh said carefully, that one of the analysts asked initially whether there had been a security breach. She paused. There had not. The conclusion is that you arrived at the same threat assessment independently through a different methodology and reached conclusions consistent with the intelligence community's own analysis. Emma sat with that for a moment. She thought about the simulation room at 4 a.m. She thought about the 54 iterations. She thought about the accident report she had read 17 times when she was 14 years old, learning to trace backward from outcomes to the moment where the trajectory was fixed. She thought about all the folders that had been returned to her marked outside scope, not forwarded within tolerance. I know, she said quietly. Walsh blinked. I knew my model was right, Emma said. I didn't know about the classified assessments, but I knew the model was right. That's why I kept submitting it. Walsh looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Hale. And in that look was something that Emma recognized, the look of someone deciding how much of a reckoning to call and in what order and in front of whom. Colonel Hale, Walsh said, not loudly. I'd like to discuss the disposition of Sergeant Carter's reports. Hale looked up. His face was a man's face at the end of a very long night, at the beginning of a very long accounting. Yes, he said, so would I. What followed was 3 hours of the most precise and uncomfortable conversation Emma Carter had ever been present for, and she had been present for some uncomfortable ones. Walsh and her colleagues went through every one of Emma's 14 reports, cross-referenced with the disposition records, which showed with documentary clarity the chain of dismissals, Gloss to Patterson, Patterson to Hale to the wastebasket, and in one case literally out a window into the rain. Gloss testified first. He was honest in the way he had told Emma he would be fully specifically without softening the parts that cost him. He said he had known Emma's thermal stress analysis was credible. He said he had let institutional hierarchy be an excuse not to push harder. He said it clearly on record, and Emma sat across the table from him and understood that honesty at cost was its own form of courage even when it came late. Patterson was next. He was less forthcoming. He used the language of institutional process standard parameters, scope of function chain of command, with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years learning to say difficult things in ways that distributed the weight of them across systems rather than individuals. Walsh listened to him patiently and then asked with a quiet that was more devastating than any raised voice could have been. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, in your professional assessment, was Sergeant Carter's microfracture analysis on the 217 technically sound? Patterson was silent for 4 seconds. Yes, he said, and you returned it marked outside scope of maintenance function. The scope, was it technically sound? Walsh said again. Same quiet, same patience. Yes, Patterson said. Emma did not look at him when he said it. She was looking at her notebook, which Walsh had returned to her, and she was looking at the first entry she had made on the 217, the date, the measurements, the calculations, and she was thinking about how much simpler everything would have been if someone had looked at it then, 6 months earlier, before 54 simulations, before a 2 a.m. alert in an unauthorized combat sortie in a room full of people who were only now, under formal investigation, finding it possible to say the things that had always been true. Hale went last. He sat across from Walsh and Emma sat to Walsh's left. And Hale looked at Emma once before he began speaking and then did not look at her again for the entirety of his testimony. It was, Emma would think afterward, one of the more revealing things she had ever seen. Not the looking away, but the reason for it, which was not contempt or dismissal, but something that looked, in a man like Marcus Hale, remarkably like shame. He was thorough. She gave him that. He did not minimize or deflect or use the language of process the way Patterson had. He described his decision-making with a directness that clearly cost him acknowledge specifically the morning he had thrown her report out the window, acknowledged that he had not read it before doing so, acknowledged that when Mercer had brought the same analysis to him on the night of the engagement, he had initially resisted it not because he had assessed it and found it wanting, but because of who it came from. I want to be precise about that, Hale said, and his voice was steady in the way voices are steady when the steadiness is being maintained by effort rather than ease. It wasn't that I evaluated Sergeant Carter's analysis and concluded it was wrong. It was that I didn't evaluate it. I saw where it came from, and I concluded it couldn't be worth evaluating. That was my failure. It was not a failure of process. It was a failure of judgment, my judgment. The room was very still. Walsh wrote something on her pad. Colonel Hale, she said, is there anything else you'd like to add for the record? Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sergeant Carter spent 4 years at this base being exactly the kind of asset this institution says it wants, technically exceptional, analytically rigorous, committed to mission outcomes above personal recognition. She used every channel available to her. She followed every protocol. She was dismissed at every point. He paused. The failure was not hers. The record should be clear about that. Emma looked at him when he said it. He was still looking at the table, but she looked at him because she had spent 4 years in rooms where people talked about her and past her and around her, and this was the first time someone with his rank and his history had spoken about her on record in a way that was simply and completely true. She didn't feel triumphant. She had thought sometimes in the simulation room at 4 a.m. about what it would feel like when this moment came, when the institution was finally forced to see what it had been looking at for 4 years and refusing to recognize. She had thought it might feel like vindication, like the weightlifting. It felt like grief, actually. A quiet, specific grief for all the time that had been spent on the wrong side of a door that should have been open. For the 14 reports in the 6 months, in the 54 simulations that should have been 10 simulations in a conversation and a promotion, for the version of the story that could have happened if one person at any point had simply looked. After the testimony concluded, Walsh called a recess. The investigators gathered their materials and stepped out, and Emma sat alone at the table for a moment with her notebook in front of her, and the recording devices still on the table, and the empty chairs on both sides. Mercer came and sat down across from her. "You okay?" he said. Emma considered the question honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I thought being right would feel better than this." "Being right was never the problem," Mercer said. "The problem was that the institution wasn't built to recognize it." "I know," Emma said. "That's what I'm grieving." Mercer looked at her. His face was quiet and serious, and she thought the face of a person who was genuinely trying to understand something he had not previously understood. "What happens now?" he said. "To you. What do you want to happen?" Emma thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, not with wishfulness, not with the inflated currency of hope, but with the same precise honesty she brought to maintenance reports and simulation scenarios, and the question of whether a microfracture in a fuel line connector was going to become something worse. "Flight status," she said. "Real flight status. Not an emergency authorization that gets reviewed and revoked. Not a citation in a report. I want to fly." She paused. "I've always wanted to fly. I just knew I had to earn the right to say so." "You earned it 4 years ago," Mercer said. "I earned it tonight," Emma said. "That's how it works. Not how it should work. How it works." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "Walsh's team is going to recommend a formal review of the promotion and qualification records for all maintenance personnel at Eagle Ridge," he said. "I heard them talking before the recess. They're also going to recommend a structural review of the report processing chain. Your documentation is going to be the basis for both." Emma nodded. She had expected something like that. "There's something else," Mercer said. His voice shifted slightly lower, more careful. "The Pentagon analysts who reviewed your formation model, Walsh told you they were struck by the match with classified assessments. What she didn't say," he paused, "is that one of them asked to meet you." Emma looked at him. "Who?" "Brigadier General Patricia Siu," Mercer said. "Air Combat Command. She's the one who built the classified threat projection model your analysis matched." The room was very quiet. Emma thought about what that meant. She thought about it in the way she thought about the Northeast Corridor gap, tracing forward from the current position, mapping the possible trajectories, identifying which outcomes were realistic and which ones were noise. "When?" Emma said. "She's at Eagle Ridge now," Mercer said. "She came in this morning. She watched the engagement footage before the debrief started. She asked Walsh specifically to make sure you were available for a meeting this afternoon." Emma sat with that for a moment. Brigadier General Patricia Siu, Air Combat Command, the woman who had built with the full resources of the United States intelligence apparatus, a threat model that matched what Emma Carter had built alone in a dark room at 4 a.m, with open source data and 400 hours of simulation. "She built the same model," Emma said slowly. "She built the same model," Mercer confirmed, "using classified intelligence." "Yes. And I built it using..." "Nothing," Mercer said. "Nothing she had, nothing anyone gave you. Just..." He paused, searching for the word, "just you." Emma looked at the table. She thought about her father reading the wind with his whole body. She thought about the accident report. She thought about a 14-year-old girl who had decided quietly and absolutely what her life was going to be for, and who had then spent 20 years building the tools to fulfill that decision in stolen hours and borrowed access and the kind of stubborn patient. Relentless faith in her own perception that the world had given her every possible reason to abandon. She hadn't abandoned it. She had never come close to abandoning it. "What time?" Emma said. 1400, Mercer said. Emma nodded. She looked at her notebook. She thought about the page where she had written on April 14th, Mercer. "He's going to try. It won't work, but he's going to try." And underneath it, 51 times. The window is still there. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote the time. She wrote Walsh IG office. 14 reports confirmed credible. Pentagon model match confirmed. Hale testified. On record? She paused. Then she wrote one more line. 55 times, the window closed. She closed the notebook. She put it in her chest pocket where it had always lived, where her father's memory lived, where 4 years of being right in the wrong building lived, where everything she had carried without permission or acknowledgement or relief had been accumulating for long enough. At 12:30, while Emma was eating a meal she barely tasted in a corner of the mess hall she had always occupied alone, three things happened in quick succession that she learned about secondhand over the course of the afternoon. First, the engagement footage from the Northeast Corridor was formally classified as a significant tactical event and flagged for distribution to Air Combat Command training divisions. Second, the 217 was grounded pending a full structural review that would the maintenance officer, confirmed in writing, follow the exact protocol Emma had been recommending for 6 months. Third, and most quietly, most significantly, a request was processed through Eagle Ridge administrative channels, not by Emma, not by Mercer, but by someone in the Inspector General's office on the basis of the morning's testimony and the engagement record requesting that Sergeant Emma Carter's file be reviewed for flight qualification candidacy. The request was marked urgent. It was signed by Brigadier General Patricia Co. Emma didn't know about the third thing until Mercer told her at 13:50, 10 minutes before her meeting with the general in the corridor outside the conference room where CO was waiting. She signed it herself, Mercer said, this morning, before she'd even spoken to you. Emma stood in the corridor and processed that. She thought about what it meant, not sentimentally, not with the inflated weight of the moment pressing on it, but precisely the way she processed everything, tracing from effect back to cause. A brigadier general who had built the same model Emma had built using everything the United States intelligence community had watched 40 minutes of engagement footage and signed a flight qualification request before the morning was over. She knew, Emma said slowly, from the footage. She recognized the model. She recognized the mind behind the model, Mercer said. Emma looked at the conference room door. Carter, Mercer said, you've been preparing for this meeting your whole life. You just didn't know it. Emma thought about that. Then she straightened, put her hand briefly on the notebook in her chest pocket, and pushed the door open. Brigadier General Patricia Co. was 61 years old with close-cropped, gray hair, in the posture of someone who had spent 4 decades refusing to take up less space than she needed. She was standing at the window, not looking out of it, just standing in the way people stand when they have been waiting with purpose, and when Emma walked in, she turned and looked at her with eyes that were doing the same thing Emma's eyes always did, measuring, calculating, filing. They looked at each other for a moment. Then CO said, you built the compression strike model from open source data. Yes, ma'am, Emma said. Walk me through the methodology. Emma sat down. She opened her notebook, and she began to talk in the precise and unhurried way she had always talked about the things she knew to a woman who was, for the first time in 4 years, not just listening, but tracking. Following every step, every assumption, every calculation, nodding not to be polite, but because the logic was sound, and they both knew it. They talked for 90 minutes. The meeting that had been scheduled for 30 minutes became 90 because neither of them wanted to stop not from sentiment, but from the rarer and more urgent pleasure of two people who think in the same register finally being in the same room. CO pushed back on 3 points. Emma defended 2 of them and conceded one, explaining precisely why she conceded it and what she would change in the model to address the gap. CO wrote something down when Emma conceded the point. You know why I'm writing that down, CO said. Because I updated the model in real time, Emma said, in front of you, with no defensiveness about being wrong. Most people, CO said, don't do that. Most people, Emma said, are more invested in being right than in being accurate. Those aren't the same thing. CO looked at her for a moment. Then she set down her pen. Sergeant Carter, she said, I have spent 30 years in Air Combat Command watching this institution do what it did to you. I have watched it happen to women. I have watched it happen to enlisted personnel. I have watched it happen to anyone whose excellence arrived in a form the institution didn't recognize. She paused. I have not always done enough to stop it. The work I've done in the last decade on threat assessment methodology, a significant part of it has been trying to build systems that capture insight regardless of where it comes from. She looked at Emma's notebook. You built one of those systems yourself, in your spare time, in a room you weren't supposed to be in. Emma said nothing. There was nothing to add to that wasn't already in the record. What do you want? CO said. Not what you think is realistic, not what you think you're allowed to ask for. What do you want? Emma looked at her. To fly, she said, to do this work at the level it deserves to be done, to never again be in a position where the only place I can run a scenario is a simulation room at 4 in the morning because no one with authority will give me access to the real thing. She paused. And I want the system to change, not just for me, For the next person who knows something that no one is listening to. Seo looked at her for a long time. That's a large ask, she said. I know, Emma said. I've been working up to it for 4 years. Something moved across Seo's face, not quite a smile, but the shape that faces make when a smile is being held back, out of professionalism, rather than absence. I signed your flight qualification request this morning, she said. I know, Emma said. Mercer told me. I signed it before I met you, Seo said, based on the footage alone. I know that too. Seo looked at her. Doesn't that bother you? That someone made a significant decision about your career based on 40 minutes of footage before speaking to you. Emma thought about it honestly. No, she said, because it was the right decision. And because the alternative is what happened for 4 years. I'll take being recognized too fast over being dismissed indefinitely. Seo nodded slowly. She gathered her materials. She stood. The formal flight qualification review will take 6 to 8 weeks, and she said, in the meantime, you will continue your maintenance duties. You will also be formally attached to the Tactical Analysis Division at Eagle Ridge as a consultant on formation vulnerability assessment. She paused. And Sergeant Carter, the 14 reports. All of them. They will be reviewed, formally acknowledged, and entered into the institutional record with full credit to their author. Emma stood. She held out her hand. Seo shook it firmly. The handshake of an equal, the kind Emma had been offering her whole career to people who had shaken it back like it was a transaction rather than a recognition. One more thing, Seo said at the door. The simulation room, East Corridor, Building 7. Emma went still. Ma'am, you've been using it at night, Seo said. Unauthorized. Her voice was completely neutral. 400 hours of unauthorized simulation access by my estimate based on your engagement performance data. Emma met her eyes. Yes, ma'am. Seo held her gaze for one long, precise moment. Consider it authorized, she said, retroactively. She walked out. Emma stood in the conference room alone, with the door open and the corridor sounds coming in the afternoon light doing what afternoon light does indifferently, regardless of what happens in the rooms it moves through. She put her hand on the notebook in her chest pocket. She thought about the 55th time, about the window closing, about her father reading the wind, about 14 years old and the decision she had made, quiet and absolute about what she was going to be for. The decision had held, all the way through. She walked back to Bay 3. The aircraft were waiting. They were always waiting. And Emma Carter, who had been seen now, finally completely, by the people with the power to do something with the seeing. Tomorrow, Emma Carter went back to work, because the work had never stopped, because it had always been the work, because the wrench in her hand and the notebook in her pocket and the mind that had built 54 scenarios in a dark room that no one knew about, those things had always been the same thing. They were still the same thing, and she was only just getting started. The 6 weeks that followed were the strangest of Emma Carter's life. Not because they were difficult. Difficulty was something she had navigated for 4 years without flinching, and she had built up the kind of tolerance for it that only comes from having no alternative. The strangeness was something else entirely, the specific disorientation of a person who has spent so long pushing against a wall that when the wall finally moves, the momentum of all that pushing has nowhere to go. She kept waking at 4 in the morning, not from habit exactly, but from the residual alert of a body that had trained itself to expect resistance and didn't quite know what to do with the absence of it. She still went to the simulation room, not because she needed to hide there anymore. Seo had made that very clear, but because it was where she thought best and the thinking still needed to happen. The formal attachment to the Tactical Analysis Division meant she now had official access to briefing materials she had previously been working around. Classified threat assessments and current formation protocols in the kind of institutional intelligence that she had been reverse engineering from open sources for months. Reading them was a strange experience. She kept finding things she had already figured out. She kept finding gaps she had already identified. And she kept finding in the margins of her own reaction a grief that she was still learning to name the grief of seeing in official language and classified ink. Confirmation of everything the institution had spent 4 years telling her she wasn't qualified to know. Torres noticed she was quieter than usual. He said so on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week while they were working side by side in Bay 3, the way they always had, with the comfortable rhythm that hadn't changed, even though nearly everything around it had. "You're in your head," he said. "I'm always in my head," Emma said, more than usual. She considered denying it. Then she set down her wrench and looked at him honestly, because Torres had earned honesty. He had flagged the fuel flow regulator. He had been the first person on the tarmac when she landed. He had put his hand briefly on her shoulder in the dark, and that 2 seconds had stayed with her longer than most of the official conversations that had followed. "I keep thinking about the version of this that didn't happen," she said. "The version where someone reads the first report, where the 217 gets pulled from the rotation in February, where nobody has to wait for enemy aircraft in American airspace to find out I was right." She paused. That version would have been better. For everyone. Torres was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "it would have." He picked up his clipboard. "But it's not the version we got." "No," Emma said, "it's not." "So what do you do with the version you got?" Emma picked up her wrench. She looked at the aircraft in front of her. She thought about Brigadier General Seo and the words she had said in the conference room about building systems that capture insight regardless of where it comes from. She thought about the 14 reports in the 6 months and the 54 simulations and the 2 seconds of a hand on her shoulder in the dark. "You use it," Emma said. "Every piece of it, even the parts that cost you." Torres nodded once in the way people nod when something has confirmed something they already believed. And they went back to work. The formal review board convened in the 5th week. It was a different kind of room than the IG investigation, less adversarial, more evaluative, the room of people who had already accepted the facts and were now trying to determine what to build from them. Walsh was present along with 2 officers from Air Combat Command, a flight surgeon, a senior instructor from the Air Force Academy's Advanced Tactics program, and Brigadier General Seo, who sat at the head of the table with the same purposeful stillness she had brought to every room Emma had seen her in. They reviewed the engagement footage, all 41 minutes of it. Emma sat through it in silence, watching herself fly through the northeast corridor on a screen at the front of the room, and the experience was profoundly strange. Watching your own decisions play out with the detached clarity that only comes from seeing them from the outside, from the perspective of the radar display and the recorded telemetry. The data that had measured everything she had done without editorializing about whether she was supposed to be doing it. The Air Force Academy instructor, a man named Colonel Whitfield, who had the compact, considered manner of someone who had spent 30 years turning good pilots into excellent ones, paused the footage at the moment Emma had refused the Southwest feint. He replayed it twice. Then he looked at her over the top of the display. "You made that call in under 2 seconds, he said. "The feint commitment, the decision to hold position, under 2 seconds. "Yes, sir," Emma said. "Most pilots with full tactical training take 4 to 6 in a live engagement environment." He paused. "What were you doing in those 2 seconds?" Emma thought about how to answer honestly. "Confirming," she said. "I'd already made the decision 54 times. In the live engagement, I wasn't deciding, I was confirming that the conditions matched the model closely enough that the decision still held. It did, so I held." Whitfield looked at the frozen image on the screen. He looked at Seo. Something passed between them, professional and quick, and weighted with implications that Emma was aware of without being able to fully read. "What's your threat pattern recognition accuracy in simulation?" Whitfield asked. "Across the scenarios I've run, 91% in the first 30 seconds of engagement," Emma said, "rising to 97% after 60 seconds as additional behavioral data confirms or updates the initial assessment." The room was quiet. The flight surgeon, a woman named Major Hanks, who had been largely silent through the morning, looked up from her notes. "Those numbers," she said carefully, "are those self-reported?" "They're in my training logs," Emma said. "I documented every session. The logs are in the notebook you have." Hanks looked at Walsh, who confirmed with a nod. Hanks looked back at Emma. 97% at 60 seconds, she said. She stopped. She wrote something down. Whitfield unpaused the footage. They watched Emma close the northeast corridor gap. They watched the adversary of formation hesitate, just begin to come apart at its tactical seams as the timing window it had been built around dissolved. They watched the contacts withdraw. When the footage ended, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Seo said without preamble, "Flight qualification, expedited track, recommendation," Whitfield said without hesitation, "approved." Hanks looked up from her notes. Approved. The two Air Combat Command officers looked at each other. One of them, a lieutenant colonel whose name was Reyes, said, I want to note for the record that I've been reviewing tactical engagement footage for 11 years, and I have never seen a first-time live engagement executed with that level of precognitive accuracy. He paused. Approved. CO looked at Emma. The expedited flight qualification track is 8 weeks, she said. At the end of it, if you complete the requirements, and based on what I've seen, that is not a question of whether but of when you will receive official flight status as a commissioned officer. Emma held very still. Commissioned officer, she said. The promotion review is concurrent with the flight qualification, CO said. Your record, the IG findings, and the engagement documentation together constitute a case that the promotion board found. She paused with the particular precision of someone choosing a word carefully, unambiguous. Emma looked at the table for a moment. She thought about the 14 reports. She thought about outside scope of maintenance function. She thought about the folder that had been thrown in the trash without being read, and then out a window into the rain, and then into the permanent institutional record as Exhibit A in an Inspector General investigation. I have a question, Emma said. Of course, CO said. The 14 reports, the formal acknowledgement you mentioned, what does that look like specifically? Walsh answered. Each report will be entered into the Eagle Ridge institutional record with its original submission date and full credit to you as the author. The disposition record, meaning the record of how each report was handled, will also be entered, completely, without redaction. Including the disposal methods, Emma said. A pause. Yes, Walsh said, including those. Emma nodded. She thought about what that meant, not for her career, not for the promotion, not for any of the things that were legitimately significant and that she would process fully later. She thought about what it meant for the record, for the permanent, institutional, unchangeable record, that Emma Carter had been right, that she had been right 14 times, that she had submitted the work through every proper channel and it had been thrown away, and that this was now documented, completely and without redaction in the institution that had done the throwing. Records she had written in her notebook years ago have a way of eventually mattering. She had been right about that too. The 8 weeks of flight qualification were the hardest thing Emma Carter had ever done, and also, without question, the most alive she had ever felt. Not the hardest, because she struggled with the material she had spent 4 years learning the aircraft from the inside out, and 400 hours in simulation, and the physical act of flying, which she had feared might be the gap between her and the pilots. She had always watched through a pane of invisible glass, turned out to be something her body took to, with an ease that her flight instructors noted, and then noted again, and then stopped noting and simply accepted. What was hard was the pace of it, the compression of 4 years of deferred desire into 8 weeks of official permission. The experience of being in a cockpit with authorization with instructors, with the full weight of institutional acknowledgement behind her, it felt sometimes like breathing pure oxygen after years of rationed air, overwhelming in its sufficiency. Her primary flight instructor was a captain named Osi, who had a reputation for being demanding in the specific way that excellent teachers are demanding, not from cruelty, but from the refusal to pretend that less than a person's best is acceptable when that person is capable of more. He had reviewed her simulation logs before their first session and had come in with the expression of someone who had been told something remarkable and was reserving judgment until they had verified it themselves. He verified it in the first week. By the third week, he stopped correcting her and started asking her questions instead. By the fifth week, he was bringing scenarios to their sessions that he had developed himself, stress testing her threat recognition against patterns she hadn't previously seen, watching what she did when the model didn't immediately fit the data. She updated the model every time in real time with no defensiveness about the updating the way she had done in front of SEO in the conference room. She updated and adapted and kept flying, and Osei watched her do it with an expression that became over 8 weeks something between professional admiration and personal investment. The expression of a teacher who has understood that what they are seeing is not just a talented student, but the rarest thing a mind that genuinely cannot stop improving itself. You don't get defensive when you're wrong, he said after a session in the 6th week where she had misread an approach angle and corrected it within 3 seconds. Being wrong is information, Emma said. Why would I be defensive about information? Osei looked at her. You'd be surprised, he said. How many pilots don't see it that way? I'd be surprised, Emma said, by very little at this point. He laughed at that. It was the first time he had laughed in 6 weeks of working together, and it changed the room slightly. The way genuine laughter always does, it made the space more honest. Carter, he said, I want to tell you something and I want you to hear it correctly. He paused. I have been instructing for 9 years. I have worked with pilots who came through the Academy pilots, who came up through ROTC pilots, who came from every pipeline this institution has. I have never, he stopped. He started again. You are going to be one of the best tactical pilots this Air Force has ever produced. That is not a compliment. That is an assessment. Emma looked at him. She thought about Whitfield at the review board saying 97%. She thought about Seo saying the word unambiguous. She thought about Torres saying you use it every piece of it. I know, she said quietly. Does that feel strange to say? It feels true, Emma said. Strange and true aren't mutually exclusive. The graduation from the expedited qualification track happened on a Wednesday morning, 8 weeks and 1 day after the review board. It was not a ceremony in the traditional sense, no crowd, no flags, no formal parade. Just a room with Seo, Osei, Whitfield, Mercer Walsh, and Gloss, who had asked to be present and had been told yes without anyone making a point of the asking. Torres was there too. He was the only maintenance crew member in the room. Nobody had specifically invited him. He had simply appeared in his dress uniform 5 minutes before the proceedings began and stood along the wall in the same spot Mercer had stood in the command center on the night of the engagement, and nobody had asked him to leave because there was no reason to ask him to leave, and at least one very good reason for him to be there. Seo read Emma's promotion order. The language was formal and procedural, the language of institutions marking the boundaries of official change, and Emma listened to it and understood that the words themselves were less important than what they represented. Not her worth, which had never changed, but the institution's willingness to finally say out loud what had always been true. Lieutenant Emma Carter, United States Air Force. Flight status confirmed. Promotion effective immediately. Seo looked up from the order. She looked at Emma. Is there anything you'd like to say? Emma had thought about this. She had thought about it the way she thought about everything, not with performance in mind, not with the audience in mind, but with the truth in mind, the specific and particular truth of this specific and particular moment and what it actually contained. I want to say something about my father, Emma said. He was a crop duster pilot in Idaho. He died when I was 14 because a component failed that should have been caught. I read the accident report 17 times. And then I decided that I was going to spend my life making sure the aircraft were safe, that the people inside them came home. She paused. Everything that happened, the reports, the simulations, the night in the Northeast Corridor, all of it was that decision. The same decision I made at 14, nothing else. The room was quiet. Then Mercer said from across the room in a voice that was very carefully controlled, "For what it's worth, Carter, he would have been proud." Emma looked at him. She held the look for a moment. I know, she said, and she meant it simply without inflation or performance the way she meant everything. What happened next moved faster than Emma expected, and she had spent enough time modeling complex systems to know that rapid change, once an institution commits to it, tends to compound in ways that exceed initial projections. The engagement footage was declassified for training purposes 6 weeks after the qualification ceremony. Within a month, it was part of the mandatory review curriculum at the Air Force Weapons School, not as an example of exceptional individual performance, though it was that, but as a case study in formation, vulnerability, identification, and adaptive defensive response. Whitfield had championed the inclusion, and the curriculum notes he wrote described the Northeast Corridor engagement in language that Emma read once and then put away because it was accurate, and she didn't need it to be anything more than accurate. The structural review of the report processing chain at Eagle Ridge, the one Walsh had recommended, was completed in the 10th week after the engagement and produced 47 specific recommendations, of which 39 were adopted immediately, and the remaining 8 were flagged for broader Air Force-wide policy review. Emma was not consulted in the drafting of the recommendations, but she was acknowledged in the preamble of the final report as the subject whose case had made the review necessary and whose documentation had provided the evidentiary basis for the most significant recommendations. She read that preamble once. She wrote the date in her notebook. Then she moved on. The conversation that she had not anticipated that arrived without warning and from a direction she had not modeled came on a Friday afternoon in the 11th week when Seo called her into a meeting with no prior indication of the subject. Seo was alone in the conference room. No legal pads, no recording devices, no other officers. Just Seo sitting at the table with a folder in front of her and the expression Emma had learned to read over 12 weeks of intermittent contact, the expression that preceded a statement with significant implications. "I want to offer you something," Seo said without preamble, "and I want you to take time before you answer." "What is it?" Emma said. "A position at Air Combat Command," Seo said. "Tactical analysis and threat assessment development. You would be working on the next generation of defensive formation protocols, specifically using your methodology for adversarial pattern modeling to build a systematic framework that can be applied base-wide, eventually service-wide." She paused. "You would also be piloting. The position includes an active flight assignment." Emma looked at her. "You're offering me the job of preventing the situation that just happened. At scale." "Yes," Seo said. "That is precisely what I'm offering." Emma thought about it. She thought about it honestly the way she thought about everything, not with the answer she was supposed to give, not with the answer that was strategically optimal, but with the answer that was true. "The people this position is designed to help," Emma said slowly. "The next person who knows something nobody is listening to. The next person with 14 reports that go in the trash. Is that actually something this position can address? Or is it," she paused, "is it a way of capturing my methodology without changing the conditions that made it necessary to develop it in secret?" Seo looked at her for a long moment. That, she said, is exactly the right question. "I know it is," Emma said. "What's the answer?" "The answer," Seo said, "is that it's both. And the only way to make it more of the first and less of the second is to have someone in the position who will not allow it to be otherwise." She paused. "Someone who has spent 4 years understanding exactly what the wrong conditions cost. Someone who will not let the institution use the position as a way of feeling like it has solved the problem without actually solving it." Emma looked at the table. She thought about the 14 reports. She thought about the simulation room. She thought about Torres and Diaz and Gloss and Mercer and the specific weight of 4 years in a building that had a place for her skills, but not for her understanding of what those skills meant. She thought about the version of the story where someone reads the first report in February. Then she thought about the version where that doesn't happen, where Emma Carter ends up in a position to build a system that means it can't happen again, not just at Eagle Ridge, not just to her, but to everyone who comes after. The person who is right and is not being heard. The person whose notebook is full of numbers that no one has yet looked at. The person who is at 4 a.m. in a room they're not supposed to be in because the rooms they're supposed to be in have never been made available to them. "Yes," Emma said. "I'll take it." Seo nodded once. "Good. One condition," Emma said. Seo raised an eyebrow. "The framework I build," Emma said, "the adversarial pattern modeling methodology, it gets documented in full, accessible to maintenance personnel, intelligence analysts, anyone whose job involves understanding how things fail, not just pilots, not just officers. Anyone who does the work that produces insight regardless of what their rank is or what their job title says they're authorized to think about." She paused. "The insight has to be able to move. It can't be gated by the same hierarchies that gated it before." Seo looked at her for a moment. "That will require significant institutional negotiation." "I know," Emma said. "I'm good at patient." Something moved across Seo's face, and this time she didn't hold the smile back. It was brief and contained the smile of a woman who had spent 40 years in an institution that required that particular restraint, but it was real. "Yes," Seo said, "you are." Emma Carter flew her first official mission as a commissioned officer on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after she accepted Seo's offer in the clear, cold air above the Nevada desert in the aircraft she had maintained with her hands before she flew with her mind. She didn't think about the milestone while she was flying. She didn't think about the 14 reports or the throne folder or the 4 years or the 54 simulations. She thought about the aircraft and the sky and the specific technical requirements of the mission profile the way she had always thought when she was doing the work that needed to be done. But when she landed and the canopy opened and the cold air hit her face. She sat in the cockpit for exactly 30 seconds before she climbed down. She put her hand on the notebook in her chest pocket. She thought about her father reading the wind over the potato fields. She thought about the accident report. She thought about the decision that had been made at 14, quiet and absolute about what a life was for. The decision had held all the way through every thrown folder and closed door, and outside scope and within tolerance. Through 54 simulations and 1 live engagement, and 8 weeks of official training, and 14 reports that had become in the permanent institutional record, the documented proof that she had always been right. Through every 4 in the morning and every borrowed hour, and every piece of knowledge she had built in the dark from nothing but her own intelligence and the specific, stubborn, relentless refusal to believe that the truth changed based on who was saying it. The decision had held, and on the other side of it was not just a flight status and a promotion and a position at Air Combat Command. On the other side of it was a framework beginning to be built that would make it harder, not impossible, but harder for the next person with the right answer to spend 4 years being the wrong rank to give it. That was the real thing. That was what Emma Carter had been carrying the whole time without knowing the full shape of it in the chest pocket of her flight suit, beside the notebook where she had written down every number that mattered. She climbed down the ladder. Torres was there. He always seemed to be there when it mattered, and she had stopped being surprised by this and had started simply being grateful for it. In the quiet, specific way, she was grateful for things that were true and reliable and asked nothing in return. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. She walked past him toward the operations building, toward the work that was waiting, toward the framework that still needed to be built, and the institution that still needed to be changed, and all the people who were somewhere right now in their own version of the simulation room, running their own scenarios in the dark, waiting for someone to acknowledge what they already knew. She was going to make sure someone did, not because she had been told to, not because the system had finally worked the way it was supposed to, because it hadn't. The system had failed for 4 years before it worked for 1 night. But because Emma Carter had learned at 14 years old, reading an accident report 17 times in a kitchen in Boise, Idaho, that the most important work is the work that prevents the failure, the work that happens before, the work that nobody sees until the moment it matters, and then cannot unsee. She had been doing that work her whole life. She was going to keep doing it. And somewhere above the Nevada desert, pilots were already flying tactics that a mechanic had built in secret in the dark, and the next time an adversary looked for the gap in the formation, they were not going to find it, because Emma Carter had closed it. And because Emma Carter was now building the system to make sure it stayed closed. That was what genius looked like when it was finally allowed to do what it had always been capable of. Not a miracle, not an accident, not a single extraordinary night. A decision made at 14 that had never once wavered. And the work, all of it, every piece of it, had always been exactly enough.